I don't know what it is about the woods that makes people feel both safe and exposed at the same time. Maybe it's the way silence feels thicker out there, like it's pressing against your ears, or maybe it's how the trees seem to shift just a little every time you look away. For years, people have gone camping to escape their routines, to breathe cleaner air, to find peace, but every once in a while, that peace turns on you. It waits until your fire burns low, until the air grows colder, until the last ember fades into black, and then it shows you that you were never really alone out there. I used to love camping. I grew up in the Midwest, surrounded by lakes and pine forests, where solitude was easy to find. It was supposed to be comforting, but I've learned that when the night closes in, even the gentlest sound can twist your stomach into knots. The faint splash of water when there shouldn't be any, or the whisper of something brushing against your tent. Sometimes it's just the wind, sometimes it isn't. People who spend enough nights in the wilderness eventually share a certain look when they talk about it, a half smile that doesn't reach the eyes. It's the look of someone who's heard a noise that no one else could explain. I've seen it on more than one face. A man once told me he heard his own name being called from the woods in the dead of night, even though no one knew where he was. Another swore his friend wasn't alone when he came back to the campfire. And one woman, camping near a quiet cabin outside her hometown, said a stranger watched her every move, smiling just enough to seem human. Each story starts the same. A quiet trip, a patch of forest, a sense of calm that slowly unravels. The details change, different voices, different faces, but the feeling underneath is always the same. It's that creeping awareness that something has noticed you, that you've stepped too far into a place that doesn't want you there. I used to think fear was loud, that it came with screams or footsteps or the snap of a branch. But the kind of fear I'm talking about is quiet. It crawls up your spine when the world around you goes still, when even the crickets stop singing. It's the moment you realize that the darkness between the trees isn't empty. It's watching. You tell yourself it's nothing, that you're imagining things, that the mind plays tricks when the firelight fades. But then you hear it again. A breath, a voice, or the sound of someone moving where no one should be. Maybe it's an animal. Maybe it's worse. These stories aren't about ghosts or monsters in the traditional sense. They're about people, about what happens when isolation and instinct collide. The woods have a way of stripping away everything that feels civilized. Out there, you're just another animal, small and fragile, pretending the thin fabric of your tent can keep the dark at bay. And maybe that's why these stories stay with me, because even when you're home, far from the trees, sometimes you catch yourself listening, waiting for the wind to shift, for that one sound to return. And when it does, it's already too late, because once you've heard the forest speak your name, you'll never hear silence the same way again. It was supposed to be my last camping trip of the year, one final weekend before winter came and sealed the woods in ice. I drove north into Minnesota, where the air gets colder and thinner and the lakes look like mirrors when the wind stops. I'd been to this place before, a small lake hidden between ridges of pine and birch. It wasn't on any map you'd find at a gas station, and that was part of why I liked it. I could build a fire, watch the ripples on the water, and pretend the world ended a few miles back down the trail. For the first 3 days, it was perfect. I woke with the sunrise, cooked on the fire, hiked through the brush, and swam in the still water. No phone, no noise, no one around for miles. The kind of quiet that felt alive. But on the fourth morning, that peace cracked. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold light, still half asleep, and froze. There were footprints, big, heavy, boot-shaped prints stamped all around my campsite. Some of them led straight up to the door of my tent. They hadn't been there when I went to sleep. I didn't even own boots that size. The earth was soft enough to show that whoever it was had walked slowly, deliberately, circling my tent at least twice before leaving toward the tree line. I stood there barefoot for a long time, my breath coming out in little clouds, trying to figure out what made less sense, that someone had found me in the middle of nowhere, or that they'd left without taking or saying anything. I spent most of the morning walking around the lake, scanning the ground for more tracks. The woods were empty, no broken branches, no cigarette butts, no sound but the wind. Eventually, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a lost hunter. Maybe some idiot who got turned around at night. I didn't pack up. I didn't want to admit I was scared. But the day dragged by slower than usual. The quiet, heavier. And when the sun went down, I built the biggest fire I could manage. I sat by it long after I should have gone to sleep. The fire cracked and the wind moved through the trees, and I started to relax again. I leaned back in my chair, wrapped in my jacket, half asleep but not quite gone. That's when I heard it, a voice calling my name from the woods. It wasn't a shout, just a clear, calm call. I snapped awake and looked around. The forest was still. The lake shimmered faintly under the moonlight. No movement, no light, nothing. For a second, I thought maybe I dreamed it, but I could still feel my heart pounding against my ribs. I called out, "Hello?" And my voice echoed through the trees, empty and unanswered. I sat there for a long minute, the fire popping quietly beside me, and tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Maybe I'd been drifting into a dream. The mind does strange things when you're half asleep in silence. That's what I wanted to believe. Eventually, I felt my eyes getting heavy again. But before I could even close them, it came again. The same voice, same tone, saying my name from somewhere out in the dark. Closer this time. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but the way it said my name made my skin crawl. It sounded like someone asking for help, like they wanted me to come to them. I stood up, the chair creaking under me, and stared into the tree line. My name echoed one more time, softer, almost pleading. I took a few steps forward, stopping just at the edge of the firelight. "Who's out there?" I said. Silence. Then, after maybe 15 seconds, it called again. Not louder, not angrier, just patient. That was what scared me most. It didn't sound like someone lost, it sounded like someone waiting. Every instinct told me to go back into my tent, but curiosity and fear fought inside me. I wanted to see him. I wanted to understand how he knew my name. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Finally, I forced myself to step back and start packing. My hands were shaking. The fire was dying down, the last embers glowing red, and the darkness beyond the trees was swallowing the edges of the camp. As I stuffed gear into my bag, the voice called again, then footsteps slow, steady, crunching on the leaves, coming from somewhere past the lake. I froze, listening. Whoever it was moved with purpose, not stumbling, not lost. They knew exactly where they were going. My throat went dry. I threw my backpack on, grabbed the flashlight, and hesitated. If I turned it on, he'd see me. If I didn't, I'd have to move blind. I chose the dark. I moved fast, careful not to make too much noise, heading in the opposite direction of the voice. Every few seconds, it would call out again, each time a little closer. Then, the crunch of leaves behind me. The footsteps weren't rushing, they were matching my pace. I don't know how long I kept walking before I turned back one last time. My camp was barely visible, the faint orange of dying coals glowing between the trees. And just behind them, standing still, was a figure. Not moving, not chasing, just watching. His outline was wrong, too tall or too thin. I couldn't tell. The light flickered and then went out completely, leaving nothing but black. I ran. Branches whipped at my face and arms, my breath breaking in clouds. And the only sound louder than my heartbeat was the crunching of my boots on the frozen ground. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car through the trees, I could have cried. I threw everything in the back seat and locked the doors before starting the engine. The woods behind me were silent again. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? Someone was in the woods calling my name? They'd think I was crazy. So I drove home instead, not stopping for hours, until the trees thinned and the highway lights began. It's been 3 years since that night. I still don't know who it was or how they knew my name. Sometimes I tell myself it was a prank, that someone had followed me from town. But every so often, when I'm half asleep, I hear it again in my head, that calm voice in the dark, saying my name like it already knows I'll listen. Cameron and I were never more than work friends. But when you sit next to someone for 6 months straight, sharing bad coffee and small talk, you start to feel like you know them. We'd always joked about going camping together, two guys trying to escape the fluorescent hum of the office for a weekend under the trees. It was the kind of thing you say to make the day go faster, not something you ever expect to happen. So when I walked into work one morning and saw his desk cleared out, I figured I'd never see him again. He'd been fired. Nobody told me why. A few hours later, I got a text from him, casual, friendly, asking if I still wanted to take that trip we always talked about. He said he could use a break, some air, some quiet. Against my better judgment, I said yes. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was curiosity. A week later, I was waiting at a forest trailhead 2 hours west of the city. Cameron pulled up in an old sedan I didn't recognize, grinning like nothing had happened. He looked the same bright eyes, same easy laugh, but there was something quieter in him. Something that made me uneasy even before we started walking. We hiked for about an hour into the woods, talking about work and people we used to see every day. When I asked what happened with the job, he changed the subject. Said something about things getting weird and that he didn't want to talk about it. His voice cracked a little when he said it. I let it go. We found a small clearing near a stream and decided it was a good place to set up. The air smelled like wet pine, and the sound of running water was steady and calm. We built 2 tents, cooked lunch, and sat by the fire. Everything felt normal again, until he stood up mid-sentence, said, "Be right back," and walked straight into the trees. No explanation, no backpack, nothing. Just disappeared behind the brush. I waited 10 minutes, staring at the spot where he'd gone. When he came back, he looked pale but smiled like nothing happened. I didn't ask. A little while later, it happened again. We were talking about hiking routes when he just stopped mid-sentence, looked into the woods with this blank expression, and said, "I'll be right back." This time I watched him go, until he vanished into the dark. The forest swallowed him whole. I waited again 5 minutes, 10. The sun was starting to drop lower, the sky turning orange through the trees, and just when I was about to call out his name, he walked back into camp, calm as ever. I asked him where he'd gone, and he said, "Nowhere." That was it. No laugh, no explanation. Just nowhere. It was such a strange answer that I didn't even know how to respond. We ate dinner in near silence after that. He watched the fire, barely blinking. When he finally looked at me, there was something different in his eyes, like he was thinking of something he couldn't say out loud. We turned in early. I fell asleep fast, exhausted from the hike. But sometime after midnight, I woke up. It was one of those slow, confusing wake-ups where you don't know what pulled you out of sleep. The forest was dead quiet, no crickets, no wind, just the soft sound of water from the stream. I unzipped my tent to look around, and that's when I saw that Cameron's tent was open. Empty. His flashlight was gone too. I whispered his name once, then again louder. No answer. Then, from somewhere deeper in the trees, I heard voices. Not one, 2. Muffled, low, like people trying to argue in whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but one of them was definitely Cameron. I called out again. "Cameron?" The talking stopped. For 30 seconds, I sat frozen, my hands still on the zipper, waiting. Then he appeared, walking out of the trees, face pale in the firelight. "Who were you talking to?" I asked. He hesitated, then smiled, the kind of smile that hides something. "No one," he said. And then, right behind his words, came the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the leaves. Slow, steady, approaching. I looked over his shoulder and saw nothing but darkness. He turned his head slightly but didn't look back, like he already knew what was there. "Cameron," I said. "Who's out there?" He didn't answer. He just stood there. And for the first time I noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. The footsteps stopped, close enough that whoever it was couldn't have been more than 20 feet away. Then, one more crunch. I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone, shoved it in my pocket, and ran. I could hear Cameron say something behind me. Maybe my name, maybe something else. But I didn't stop to listen. The path was faint, hard to follow in the dark, but somehow I found it. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept running until I saw the faint glow of my car through the trees. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there shaking. My hands left sweat marks on the steering wheel. I didn't drive right away. I just stared at the trailhead, expecting to see flashlights or movement. There was nothing. Eventually, I started the car and left everything behind: my gear, my tent, all of it. When I got home, I texted him, "Are you okay?" The message never delivered. I tried again the next morning, and it said message not sent. Then, when I checked his profile, I realized he'd blocked me. That was the last I ever heard from him. I don't know what I walked away from that night, or who was out there with him, but something about the way he'd kept leaving camp makes me think he wasn't planning that trip for both of us. Sometimes I wonder if I hadn't woken up when I did, if I'd just stayed asleep until morning, whether I'd have ever made it home at all. And the worst part is, I still don't know whether he was scared of the person in the woods or working with them. I had never been camping before that week. The idea always sounded peaceful: stars, firelight, the kind of silence that people write about. I'd rented a small vacation cabin outside my hometown, surrounded by forest and lakes, the kind of place that felt safe because it was familiar. Behind the cabin, there was a narrow trail that led about a mile into the woods, ending at a small, unofficial campsite. I thought it would be perfect for a first try, close enough to the cabin that I could retreat if anything went wrong. I spent a few days preparing, buying gear, watching tutorials, feeling that nervous excitement you get when you try something new. On the morning I finally packed up and headed out. The weather was perfect, cool, bright, with a pale sun filtering through the trees. I remember thinking it was too quiet. At first, I blamed nerves. Being alone in the woods plays tricks on your senses. But after 10 minutes on the trail, I started getting that unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. It wasn't a sound, not even movement, just a weight, like eyes pressing against the back of my neck. I stopped several times, pretending to adjust my bag while I scanned the trees. Nothing, just empty woods. The trail was narrow, covered in leaves, winding up and around old roots and patches of moss. I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling, but it never faded. It followed me all the way to the clearing. The campsite wasn't much: a small patch of dirt surrounded by trees, with a half-collapsed fire ring made from stones. It didn't look used in years. That should have been enough to make me turn back, but I told myself that was the point. I wanted solitude. I unpacked, set up the tent using the step-by-step guide on my phone, and tried to shake off the unease. 15 minutes later, I was almost proud of the setup. And then, from behind me, a voice said, "Hey there." I turned. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, tall, maybe mid-20s like me. His clothes were clean but dusty, like he'd been walking for hours. What caught me wasn't his presence, but his face, the way he smiled with his mouth while the rest of his face didn't move at all. Just that hollow grin. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said. His tone was casual, friendly even, but it didn't match his eyes. They were blank, unfocused, like he wasn't really seeing me. I forced a laugh, told him it was fine, and went back to what I was doing. He stood there for a few seconds, then nodded, and began unpacking a small sling bag. That was when I noticed it wasn't a backpack. It looked barely big enough to hold a tent, and yet, that's what he pulled out. No sleeping bag, no food, no water bottle, just a tent, which he set up about 20 feet from mine. I tried not to stare, but every time I glanced over, I caught him looking right back at me, still wearing that faint, frozen smile. I told myself it was fine. People camp near each other all the time. Still, the idea of sharing that clearing with him made my skin crawl. I busied myself gathering sticks for a fire, pretending not to notice him sitting there, cross-legged, staring toward my tent. The air grew colder as the sun dipped behind the trees. The light turned amber, then blue, then gone. I hadn't planned on staying up late, but I found myself watching him, waiting to see if he'd do anything. He didn't move much, just sat outside his tent, hands resting on his knees. I didn't see him eat or drink. He never built a fire. The only sound was my own. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, but as the last bit of light disappeared, I decided I couldn't wait. I started quietly packing, trying not to make noise. That's when he stood up. Slowly, deliberately. His smile was gone now, and his expression had gone flat, like he just remembered something important. I tried to act casual, but my hands were shaking as I shoved things into my bag. He didn't say anything, didn't offer to help, just stood there watching. The air between us felt thick, electric, like waiting for thunder that never comes. Finally, I slung my pack over my shoulder and muttered something about heading back before dark. He didn't respond. I walked toward the trail, feeling his eyes on my back the entire time. I told myself not to look, but I couldn't help it. Halfway down the trail, I turned around. He was gone, or at least I didn't see him anymore. The trail behind me was empty. For the first few minutes, I let myself believe he'd stayed at camp. Then, maybe 10 minutes later, I looked again. He was there, far behind me, barely visible between the trees, walking the same path. My chest tightened. He wasn't rushing, just walking with that same calm, steady pace. I sped up. My backpack bounced against my shoulders. Branches scraped my face, but I didn't stop. Every few turns, I glanced back, and every time, he was still there. Always the same distance, like he knew exactly how fast to move. I didn't run until I saw the cabin through the trees. I burst through the back door, locked it, and dropped my bag on the floor. My breath came out ragged and uneven. The woods outside were dark now, the trail vanishing into blackness. I stood by the back window, staring out for 15 minutes straight, half expecting to see him. The forest stayed still. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe fear had made me see things that weren't there. Then someone knocked on the front door. Not a polite knock, loud, fast, insistent. I froze. The knocks turned into pounding, heavy and desperate. I could feel the vibration through the floorboards. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering into the receiver, trying not to make any sound that would tell them I was inside. As soon as I started talking, the knocking stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard footsteps circling the cabin, quick and light. Then the dull thud of something hitting the window frame. Another, louder thump. He was trying to open it. I crouched down, heart hammering, until I heard the footsteps fade away. The silence after that was worse than the knocking. I stayed there on the floor until I saw the faint flash of police lights through the trees 20 minutes later. 2 officers came, searched the woods, found nothing. His tent was gone from the clearing. They said it was probably some drifter or drug addict, that I was lucky to have somewhere to lock myself in. But I can still see his face, that empty, unmoving smile. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can hear the sound of his knuckles hitting wood, over and over, patient and steady, like he knows I'll open the door eventually. Sometimes I think about what connects all these stories. 3 different people, 3 different nights, all swallowed by the same kind of silence. It isn't the woods themselves, not really. It's what happens to you when you're out there long enough to feel the weight of being alone, when the air stops moving and every sound starts to sound like something else, when your own breathing becomes the loudest thing around you. I used to think fear was about what you see, but I know better now. It's about what waits just beyond your vision, the thing that could be there, or maybe already is. The woods are perfect for that kind of fear. They don't need monsters or ghosts, just distance, darkness, and enough quiet to make you wonder if you're hearing your own thoughts or someone else's. Maybe that's why these people all went back into the trees, because the forest offers something that cities can't. It lets you feel small, hidden, forgotten. But sometimes the forest looks back. It listens. It learns your name. And once it does, it doesn't forget. I think about the man at the lake who heard his name being called. How close he must have been to answering. I think about the one who followed his friend into the dark, not realizing that friendship can hide worse things than loneliness, and the one who ran back to her cabin, still hearing the knocking long after it stopped. They all tell their stories the same way, calm at first, then slower, then quiet, like they're still trying to understand what happened. Like they're still there in the woods, replaying every sound, wondering if it was really real. People love to say they'd know when something's wrong, that instinct would save them. But instinct doesn't shout, it whispers. It tells you to look behind you when there's nothing there, to turn off your light when you feel watched, to pack up and leave before the sun goes down. The problem is, most of us don't listen until it's too late. I don't know what was following them, or if it was even human. Maybe it's just the kind of thing that happens when the wild meets the fragile parts of the human mind. But what if it wasn't? What if something in those woods has been waiting all this time, listening for the next voice to answer back? We call them stories because it's easier than calling them warnings. Easier than admitting that sometimes the strange things people describe, the voices, the figures, the footsteps, are all too specific to be coincidence. You can convince yourself that it's nothing. You can tell yourself that the mind is cruel and creative and loves to fill the dark with faces. But one day, when you're sitting by a fire and the woods go silent, you'll remember these stories. You'll glance into the trees, just to be sure. Maybe you'll see nothing. Maybe you'll hear only the wind. But if, from the edge of the darkness, something calls your name soft, patient, like it's been waiting, you won't need to ask who it is. You'll already know. Because some echoes aren't echoes at all. They're invitations. And once you hear one, the silence never feels empty again.